And we are back, almost through the book of Acts. We are in chapter 24 today. And here we see that Paul is having his trial before Felix, and we learn about all the time that he spent there in Jerusalem. Well, he's not in Jerusalem, he's in Caesarea right now, while Felix was the governor of that region. Remember, he's the Roman governor, the Roman appointed governor. And so in verses 1 through 9, we see the Sanhedrin. They have come to Caesarea, and they have brought a lawyer with him. That's who this Tertullus character is. They got a pro in because they want to get Paul. And he presents this great oration that's full of flattery. It's all made up. They didn't like Felix. And they lay these charges against Paul, hoping that the Romans will have him executed. Now, you may have noticed, especially if you have your King James, you're reading out of the King James Bible or a New King James Bible, if you compare it with an NIV or a New American Standard or ESV, a more modern English translation, you'll notice that there are some differences. In fact, if we look at verses 6 through 8, in the NIV, New American Standard, has it in brackets, ESV, all of our more recent English translations don't have verse 7, and verse 6 is cut in half, and verse 8 is cut in half. But the King James has all of that content in there. And the New King James includes all of that content in there as well, with a footnote about more modern manuscript discoveries. Now, what is the case for this? Now, I want to get on a little soapbox for a minute, because there is this kind of the KJV only camp. For people who say that the King James Version of the Bible should be the only English translation we use, it's the only accurate one, it's the only one that we can trust. That there's some conspiracy theory amongst the other translators of, they especially go after the New International Version. Now look, here's the deal. No one can deny that the King James Version of the Bible is the most important, significant, and influential English literary work ever in history. No one can deny that fact. It is. It's the most important English literary work in history. It's the most significant. It's the most influential. The King James Version of the Bible is everywhere. It's all throughout English literature. It's in our vernacular. It's goodness. It is significant. It is important. No one can deny that. And it is beautifully written. In fact, it was written to be read in churches aloud. That's why the language is, flowery is probably not the best word, but grand. Because it was meant to be heard. And that's why portions of it are so beautiful. But since then, so 1611 is the first edition of the King James Version of the Bible, and that was updated many times until the version that we use today is the 1753 edition. Since then, we have made some very significant discoveries in ancient biblical manuscripts that gives us a better understanding of what the original autographs look like, meaning the original documents, the original letters that Paul wrote, the original Luke, the original Acts. All we have today are copies. Now, we've got a lot of copies. So that's why we can be confident that what we're reading today is an accurate reflection of the manuscripts, of the autographs, But we've made some significant discoveries. The most notable of that would be the Dead Sea Scrolls. And what does that do? That gives us more insight into the autographs. And so whenever you see a difference, whenever you see a verse missing or a portion of a verse missing from the Bible, the NIV doesn't have it, but the King James does have it, is because we have a better understanding of what the autograph is. And so our modern English translations are based on a broader scope of biblical manuscripts. Since we have made more discoveries, we've discovered more ancient versions, more ancient copies. We've discovered more numbers of copies. We can actually be more confident in the accuracy of our scriptures. There's no weird conspiracy theory by the Illuminati or deep state or whoever you want to credit it to take God out of the Bible. Or come on, y'all, it's just silly. So the reason that I don't use the King James Version very much is because, one, the English is archaic, meaning you have to spend so much time explaining the English usage. Word meanings change over time, and English is one of the most fluid languages in the world, meaning our usage changes quickly. When you compare English to other languages are more stable. English changes so quickly, and that's why we need to continue to update our English translations. So words mean different things. Different expressions come into use. Different phrasing comes into use. And so to use the King James today, it bogs the preacher down in explaining the English before you can ever get to the meaning. But also, it's not as accurate. And that's not a knock on it. It is a great translation for its time. And again, it is the most influential and significant English literary work in history. Nothing can remove its place. Look, I grew up on the King James Version, and I remember when everything kind of switched to the NIV, so I've got verses memorized in both translations. But we don't need to think that people are goodness. There's some weird conspiracy. No, this is based on scholarship. It's based on wisdom, goodness. We should believe in scholarship because Luke believed in scholarship. We've read through Luke and Acts, and Luke did his research, and he did it well. And that's what we're doing by having these new Bible translations. And nothing that is different in the NIV versus the King James changes any theology or doctrine or Christian practice. We need to not be so gullible into these weird conspiracy theories. Anyway, so this is my soapbox. We can trust our modern English translations. They're good. They're solid. And there's going to be weakness in any translation because it is a translation. And that is why we've got good scholarship. That's why we've got notes in the footnotes and notes in the margins of our Bibles. That's why we have good commentaries. And that's why we have all these resources to help us, because any translation is going to falter. There's going to be some weak points at times because that's just the nature of translation. And we are blessed to have the resources to know where those points are, and so we can do some more investigation, some more studying, some more reading. So all that to say is we can trust our modern English translations. There's no weird vast conspiracy theory to undermine the gospel or God or anything like that. It's just silly. Anyway, so there you go. Now, getting back to Acts chapter 8. And again, we can see that this content that is removed in 6 through 8, it does not change anything. All right, so now when we move on, we get to verse 10 through 21. We can see that now Paul defends himself. Felix just kind of looks at him and he's like, all right, your turn. And Paul, he defends himself. And here in verse 17, Paul mentions the gift that he's brought from the other churches for the believers in Jerusalem. So he's been collecting these funds and this money to help the believers in Jerusalem. And here he mentions it in verse 17. These are the alms that he's bringing. And so that's a fun thing, because this is a big theme in Paul's letters. But here it's kind of briefly mentioned by Luke in Acts, because, again, this is not the point. That's not the point, but it did happen. Now, in verses 22 through 23, we can see Felix, he's kind of tabling this. He postpones it. He's like, oh, well, when the Roman commander comes, I'll hear you again. And he gives Paul some liberty. He's still under guard, but he has some liberty. He can have visitors and things of that nature. And then apparently he goes on a trip, because in verse 24, he's coming back. So he went somewhere and then came back. And in 24 through the end of the chapter, verse 27, we can see that Felix is listening to Paul. Paul's opportunity to preach the gospel. Obviously, Paul is able to have visits from friends and things like that. But we can see that Paul's not playing, that he's hitting on these things that we know from history that Felix had trouble with self-control. We know from history that Felix was replaced because he didn't do such a great job in handling things. And so Paul is hitting on self-control, judgment. And that's why he's like, we can also see that he's crooked. He's waiting for a bribe. He's like, this guy's going to give me some money. And so he extends this out for 2 years until he is replaced. Rome replaces him with a new governor called Festus. And we will see what happens with that in chapter 25. Now, for us, what's a good application for us? As I was reflecting on this, I just thought about what a wonderful gift integrity is. I know that that's not really the purpose of this. Now we're seeing how Paul gets to Rome. But integrity. So Paul had integrity. He didn't have to lie or make anything up in his defense. He could just state plainly what's going on, whereas the Sanhedrin, they have to come up, they have to manufacture these things. Felix, looking for bribes. The integrity of Paul is contrasted with these other groups and these other individuals, because when you have integrity, when you live by integrity, you don't have to hide anything. You don't have to be worried about things from your past coming out. You don't have to think about, now, what did I say at this time? Is it going to match up with this time? No, you live in honesty and uprightness, and you treat people with dignity and respect, and you apologize when you mess up. You don't do anything underhanded. You love your neighbor as yourself. When you live with integrity, you don't need to be worried. And integrity, goodness, integrity right now, we are seeing how important and how crucial and significant it is, especially with the Me Too movement and goodness. Our integrity is worth more than gold. And as Christians, we should be people of the highest integrity. And we should be the people who apologize the most quickly and admit when we have messed up. Again, Christianity is not some moral high ground that we stand on. No, Christianity is an admission. We are sinners and we need grace, and we don't have it all together. And that's why Jesus, right? We are saved by grace through faith. We don't have some weird moral high ground on which we can judge others. No, we recognize our need and our dependence on God. And that's why when we're given a new life in Christ, we want to live up to that and live in integrity. But when we mess up, we admit it, and we should admit it, own it, move forward with a renewed conviction to live in uprightness. So that's a great application for us today. So I'll see you in Acts 25.